Hello. Good evening. Welcome to beautiful downtown Los Angeles and to SCI-Arc, where we make it new. And we're going to make it new tonight again. My name is Michael Speaks. I run the program formerly and currently known as MRD. I'm here to introduce a speaker tonight from London. Sam Jacob from FAT, a really remarkable office. FAT stands for Fashion, Architecture, Taste. I don't know if you've checked out their website, but you certainly should. It's called the FAT Channel, and it is an amazing, amazing array of stuff of all kind. It's hard, I think, it's hard for me to describe what FAT does exactly. They are an architecture office, but they do public art. They do an amazing kind of range of design work. And without saying anything else, really, I don't want to try to make any pithy comments. Sam Jacob will make enough of those tonight. I do want to say I'm really, really very, very happy he's here. Please join me in welcoming Sam Jacob from FAT.
Okay, great. Thanks, Michael. I find it very difficult to describe what FAT does as well, but I'll do my best. FAT makes architecture, and it makes fine art, and it makes a lot of things which are kind of in between these two kind of recognizable activities. And partly this is to do with economic necessity, because I'm sure you all know how tough it is to make money as a young architecture practice, but imagine how harder that must be in a country as conservative as the UK. It's one of the sort of driving forces in exploring other avenues. So part of it is a practical issue. The other thing is that we're interested in exploring, I guess, the outer limits of what architectural practice might be and where it might go and what it might be useful for. One of the major interests, in fact, is other disciplines, is things outside of architecture and how they might have some form of influence on architectural practice. It's really to do with trying to engage with a culture outside of the architectural academy and engaging with a wider culture, the sort of culture as it's lived. One of the motivations of that is to try and stop thinking like an architect. So I'm going to show some projects, and I'm going to also talk a little bit about our approach. And to begin with, I've got a first of a few special guests who are appearing in the lecture. I'll let him introduce himself. As most things should do, this starts with Marshall McLuhan. Here he is, and he's thinking, and he's having an idea, and the idea has just appeared. And this particular idea is a really great idea. It's that a light bulb is information. And that's such a fantastic idea. The next part of it isn't maybe quite so fantastic. He says that a light bulb, we can't recognize a light bulb as information because it's pure information. And we think that's a mistake that architects often make in thinking that something can be pure and without meaning. So the first part of the lecture is to try and persuade Marshall otherwise, and that involves a trip to the hardware store. Here's some light bulbs purchased from a hardware store in southwest London about a month ago. So it's not a fantastic range, but it's a kind of very standard range. This one's an energy-saving light bulb made by General Electric. It's called Energy Saving Tech, and it is quite tech. It's got kind of glass loops and looks quite sort of spacey, I guess. The next one is another energy-saving one, but it's a little bit more elegant, don't you think? It's called Energy Saving Elegance. Right, this next one's quite tech too. It's a crown silver reflector, and it's a low glare lamp used to highlight interesting features in your home. For example, display cabinets, cupboards, etc. That's the serving suggestion. This one's from a range called Soft Light, and it's a 60-watt pink bulb. It creates a soft, diffuse light with a hint of colour to enhance and complement any decor. So you can imagine possibly wanting a pink light bulb. But this next one's from the same range, but it's beige. I mean, really? Imagine? Do you want to bathe your room in beigeness? Anyway, these are the kind of tough choices that Marshall is having to make. The next one's a fire glow. It's the kind of thing that goes into an electric heater to make it look like it's a log fire. Now they start getting weirder. This one's another General Electric bulb. It's called Croco Gold, which produces a beautiful golden lattice of light. So I don't know if you can make out, but on the surface of the glass it's got this kind of sort of intricate pattern that's glued on very badly. It's also available in ice crystal, and that's crystal with a K, either white or amber colours. And then they just keep getting better. This one is a clear candle bulb. It's 60 watts. Now this one, can you see it? It's another candle one. It's called Elegance. And you can see this one, it's got a frosted surface to it, and it's got an amazing twist to the end of it. I don't know if it shows up on the screen up there. But it's only 40 watt, but I'm sure that's okay. Now this one is a twisted candle. It's got a clear glass to it. And then this one is really, I think, the best. It's made by General Electric. It's a 60 watt halogen candle, and it's called the Halo candle. It directly replaces normal candles, but it lasts twice as long as normal candle bulbs. That's 2,000 hours, produces 24% more light for the same wattage. It's dimmable, and the light output is UV controlled. Now, this one's great. I mean, we at FAP like this because it's something which combines heritage with the future. It's a kind of techno-folk object. It's a kind of electric vernacular in a way. But it's just fantastic that it's a replica of a kind of light which existed before electricity, but it uses the same kind of technology as you get in the headlights of a BMW. So I guess the point of this is to say that if a light bulb can't be innocent and can't help containing information, then perhaps architecture, which obviously a light bulb is a very tiny part of, here's the slogan, architecture as media. So here's some architecture which is very directly media. It's a half-timbered alphabet. And here's a half-timbered building with a subliminal message in it. This was a sculpture that we made, and it's a sculpture of a house, and it's constructed out of neon. So it's again talking about architecture as something which communicates very directly. This is using neon, which is obviously associated with signage, but to use it in a spatial, three-dimensional way. In a way, it's made in opposition to the modernist idea of the house as a machine for living in, and this is a house as information for living in. So, another slogan, this one, taste, not space, which is, again, an extremist slogan, but I guess all architectural slogans should be extreme. What we're saying really is that taste is something which mainstream architecture tries to belittle and tries to say is a kind of a little bit superfluous, a little bit superficial, not quite serious enough for architecture to engage with. And this is traditionally architects' view. It's explained by Le Corbusier that fashions are something for women to be interested in, which is obviously fairly damning. The idea of saying that taste actually is at least as important as space, as the medium which architects work with, is to attempt to engage with a world outside of architectural culture in a way which is understandable and directly understandable by people who are not educated in architectural canon but are very sophisticated visually. Taste also engages with issues which radical architecture likes to talk about a lot but rarely does anything about. Taste raises issues of social class, and wealth, and hence politics. We believe by engaging with something as frivolous as taste, that architecture can become politically radical and politically engaged. So in a way, a connection with early modernist politics might be made through something which is thoroughly anti-modernist. This is a project called Red Dot, or In Praise of Decoration. It was an intervention and an installation which occurred within another exhibition, which is the summer show at the Royal Academy. This is a very sort of highly traditional show, at least it had been for about 200 years, where people send in their paintings and they get selected by the committee and put in the Royal Academy in Piccadilly in London. And there's just absolutely hundreds of these paintings stuck around the walls. So it's a very difficult visual field to begin to understand. And all these works are for sale, and traditionally they stick a little red dot next to the paintings that are sold. So we gathered together a group of people and gave them little sheets with red dots on. We went into the gallery and people started to stick these red dots, first of all, quite discreetly next to some of the works which hadn't been sold. And we were thinking, well, this is beginning to change the way in which one might experience the exhibition. By the red dot connotes monetary value. Someone's bothered to spend money on this piece of art, and also cultural value, that it's important enough for someone to spend money on. So here's someone carefully placing one red dot next to a painting. A little bit later on, there were absolutely hundreds of these dots all over the place, so covering the frames of the pictures. They'd begun to migrate to the fire extinguishers, into the shop, into the toilets, into the cafe. We eventually got chased out by the security guards. So this is a situation where ornament really is a crime. Here's a very boring house that's dreaming of being something much more exciting. In its dreams, it might look like this. So here is a kind of clash of taste, cultures, if you like, the overcoding of the form of the dull house with the exciting military surface. And inside, again, there's this kind of strange mix between the dangerous and the homely. Of course, in real life, things like that are much better, and they're much more sophisticated. Here's a garden in a suburb of Rotterdam. And again, you know, it's fairly ordinary. What we're looking at here is I guess, the amazing sophistication of the way this garden has been transformed by the people who lived there. So all of these signs of life that are added to the existing structure. So that includes kind of not very good bits of topiary, very poor quality stone lion reproductions, giant anchors, a thing to tie up a large boat to next to a very small pond that you would never get a boat that size into. Little bits of rustic detailing like carriage lamps and little house signs that are stuck onto brick walls, plastic birds, small statues of little boys thinking. And this drawing really talks about an architecture that's talking, that's saying, I am something, or an architecture that's thinking about being something. So there's an example here of the canopy over the window, perhaps thinking that it might be a Parisian cafe, but it's very orange, isn't it? And maybe that's because it's in Holland and it's very proud to be Dutch. So this is a drawing which attempts to then interpret these sorts of references and put them together in a thoroughly architectural, axonometric manner. In a way, this is a kind of perhaps it's a kind of psychoanalysis of a sort of DIY house. But you can see here that what's suggested is a kind of a series of objects which meet, which become new things, either through their proximity to something else or through the kind of overcoding of them. There's also issues to do with scale, so the interpretation of a pond as a kind of geographical body of water, or a plant pot as a large building in Brasilia. So this kind of combination of meanings and scales and ways of representing them is something that this drawing's kind of exploring. And it's really part of some research we're doing for a project which is based in this town just outside of Rotterdam, which is essentially a post-war sort of overspill new town, which has got all of the normal problems of these places, that there's no facilities for activities, this kind of thing. It's also unusual because it's located next to giant-sized bits of industry and infrastructure, like the giant petrochemical works and the huge Europort that's next to it. This is a project we're doing for a group called Crimson, who I think some of you here have worked for and possibly know. I think they've visited here. The starting point for this is that there's a very boring sort of modernist series of housing blocks which are placed in this very unusual context. It's also surrounded by a huge amount of greenery, loads of trees and lots of grass. This picture is saying that perhaps there's an imaginary version of the same place which exists, which is being built in the front gardens and on the mantelpieces of this town. So here it is, dreaming of being a model village in 1930s England. And here's a tiny addition to a very large building which begins to dream of another life. The brief for the project is for a community hall and a kind of landscape. And the idea is that it draws on some of the existing tendencies within the community and to house the kinds of activities which are already present within the community. So what we're looking at, first of all, is to try and work out what sort of building type we should be looking for. And this is something which exists on the fringes of this town, but also pretty much everywhere else. It's a very standard industrial shed. But we also think something like this might be relevant. This is a kind of glamorous version of the same kind of building. It's something which is overtly decorative and talks very much about identity in the way that perhaps this one doesn't talk about identity at all. So we're interested in kind of developing a kind of version of this, but which does this. The landscape which surrounds it, again, is something which has to develop and grow because it's really part of the community. It's not like a park that's built and presented for people to use. It has to be something which essentially self-generates. So part of the model is the pragmatic Wild West grid, but it's also interested in the imaginative life of the town which is there, and this is a sort of picturesque landscape. So again, two things which are very different. The way that this might begin to come together is in a very decorative but straightforward shed. So what this shed draws on is essentially a kind of local language. So what we have here is cut-out windows which are in the shape of things which are around. So the windows become cut-out trees, like in a Tom and Jerry film when someone runs through a wall. It's the same kind of thing. Here's a little church, and here's a kind of highway sign. There's also profiles built onto the building which begin to be quite directly communicative and referring to, I guess, a sense of civic pride. This is a view of the interior, which kind of mixes up this sort of profile sheeting with a sort of glamour of the historical basilica. And this is how the building begins to engage with the landscape, and you can see how the missing trees in the facade begin to connect with actual trees in the landscape. So the moments like the piece of the little bit of fire that's coming out of a tower in the oil refinery become big signs of things which people can be proud of and identify with. So within the landscape, there's a whole series of kind of little events which occur. So things like an outdoor cinema, showing Top Gun here, which are kind of a bit rubbish, a bit homemade, a bit kind of they've borrowed a few things and managed to get this thing together, which is to do with not designing it too much, which is to do with not being too involved, which is to do, I guess, with not thinking too much like an architect. So that things like children's play areas might be built out of very standard bits of play equipment, but just arranged in unusual ways. Other elements which are important to this landscape are things which begin to engage it with its community. So this is a suggestion for a pet cemetery, which becomes an important focus, becomes a kind of bond, an emotional bond between the community and this new place. So I think the attitude of identifying places like this as important urban moments is quite central to the project. And this is another suggestion of how the landscape might be put together, which is a series of islands which get developed as and when, okay, it's a bit architecty. And this is something, again, to do with the notion of kind of identity, really. The site faces onto a highway, and what this is a kind of weird construction halfway between a familiar landmark in this place with celebrating something which is very unlikely to be celebrated. So to write the name of the town very, very big seems like a kind of a gesture which begins to engage with the notion of civic identity. It also becomes something which is occupied, and at the moment it's occupied by pigeon fanciers. You know, people who look after pigeons and take them racing, that kind of thing. I don't know if people do that here. This is the sort of basilica-esque plan and elevations which are very communicative. So the last project is also very much to do with a sense of place. The next series of projects are concerned with place. This is a piece called Liquid Capitals, which was made for an exhibition in Ljubljana, which essentially draws a map of where one might be. And the map's composed of different bits of coastline from different countries, kind of collaged together and growing from one to the other, which is, in a way, a direct comment about the things like the flow of global capital or information, or the connection of broadcast media or electronic communication, or this kind of thing. It's really it's a piece about an idea of collapsed geography. This is a room in the Tate Modern in London, which has got a similar starting point of kind of gathering things and putting them together. So this is a kind of conglomeration of buildings and bits of landscape which form some pieces of furniture in a room. So here's a church on top of a hillside. Here's a tower block with a little bit of mountainside on it. Just a special guest, number 2. There's an idea that perhaps modernism wasn't all about industrialization, that perhaps it might have been about something else. As often been pointed out, that by the time that modernism got going, industrialization was really kind of beginning its decline. But what was beginning was radio. So we're suggesting that there's a subtext to modernism, that the kind of key modernist conditions of the glazed curtain wall and the open plan might be something to do with radio communication. It might be something to do with being in two places at the same time. In a building like the Farnsworth House, where there's glazed curtain wall. There's no division really of the rooms, and the kind of activity of the house flows from inside to outside. Might be exactly to do with the sensation of listening to something which is very geographically distant. This is a house which might look very different from the Farnsworth house, but perhaps, if you believe the idea about radio and the Farnsworth, might share something in common. It's a house which is contains an office. Here it is. And again, it's a very communicative thing. The idea really is that it says what it is. So it's an office block here. Here's the office block bit, and here's the house, which is cut out and stuck onto the front like a kind of cartoon billboard. And that includes a little bit of tree down here past the garage doors. But it's also doing things with changes in scale as well, so that the three rows of windows here are actually the windows into one room, but suggestive of a building that's much larger. The facade sort of profile changes here, and it has a kind of Amsterdam canal side scene where it looks like it's maybe 4 or 5 buildings put together. So this is a building which is saying that it's being more than one thing, and it's doing more than one thing at the same time. This is a nightclub in a place called Swindon, which is west of London on the way to Wales. And again, it's to do with a place which is more than one place. It's made up of a series of elements which are drawn from, I guess, places of leisure, really. There's a piece of running track, there's a piece of swimming pool, there's a piece of highway, there's a piece of airports, which are all laid next to each other, and these all lead down via this running track into a kind of sort of allotment, suburban kind of thing. It's to do with suggestions of other places, so that the cloakroom becomes something like an upside-down swimming pool. And it's to do with a suggestion of uses which are completely inappropriate in a nightclub, where you're getting as drunk as you can, taking as many drugs as you can, and getting off with as many people as you can. But yet this kind of athletic track is the thing that you wobble down as you're carrying, 6 bottles of beer. So this kind of disjunction between, what it suggests you should be doing and what you are doing, and also the proximity of these things next to each other, so that in this next shot, the running track ends and you end up in somewhere that you shouldn't be at the end of a running track. So it's also to do with this idea of placing things too close together than they should be. So this is where you end up once you've pulled whoever you've wanted to pull. And ironically, it's kind of what you were trying to escape from in the first place. It's your parents' front room. So a lot of these projects are to do with a sort of notion of collaging, or displacing one thing into another place, or putting two things together which don't belong together. This is a fantastic idea for upgrading cities at a very low price. It's called mod cons, and it involves the addition of very small elements to existing bits of city. This one says, make the park as handy as your own home with the new tree plug, 240 volts of opportunity. Next one, some taps on Eros in Piccadilly Circus. Or a light switch controlling the advertising hoardings in Piccadilly Circus. light pollution is your choice, it says here. So this idea of taking these essentially domestic moments and placing them into thoroughly undomestic scenario of the city, which is beginning to suggest a different kind of occupation of the city. We've run a whole series of projects which are to do with the sort of temporary reworking or rethinking of little bits of city. These often involve really us acting as curators and finding opportunities within the city to do stuff. This was a project called Roadworks, which commissioned 10 artists to work with musicians to make three-dimensional installation around a existing bus shelter. This one was by a group called Beaconsfield, who are they're a sort of arts group, and they run a gallery in South London where they thatched this kind of not very good high-tech bus shelter. They used the Thatcher of the Year 1998, I think it was, who just finished the Globe Theatre. So this is, as a piece, I guess, is about a very traditional notion of shelter, and particularly resonant in England, where everybody dreams of living in a cottage with a roof like this. It's also to do with, I guess, a sort of moment of kind of identity within the city, or the way that something can communicate within, in a very different way, within the normal life of the city. So this doesn't ask too much of people to enjoy it at all. Another similar project involved shopping bags. So these things, in a way, are quite invisible as architectural structures, but they attempt to construct a gallery, at least temporarily. These shopping bags were produced by 30 different artists and were available from 30 different shops within a small area in central London. In order to get one of these highly desirable art objects, you had to go to the shop and buy something from the shop, and you get this bag as you would do a normal carrier bag. You couldn't buy the bag, or at least you weren't supposed to. So the idea here really is first of all an architectural idea. Can you construct a program without having a building at all? Can you make a gallery which works for a month without having a gallery? So the program of gallery becomes, in a way, exploded, and in a sense, a sort of parasite on other transactions which are occurring within the city. In this case, it's shopping. It's also to do with the juxtaposition of two things which are supposedly very different, like appreciating high culture and buying a pair of socks. I mean, of course, that relationship's very confused anyway, because of the kind of rise of marketing within galleries. But this is a very sort of, it's something which is I guess, swept under the carpet a lot. And we're saying here, well, there isn't a problem. There's nothing to be embarrassed about. Looking at art isn't that different from looking at products, and that the relationship between the two can be a positive thing. It's also to do with the transformation of the most mundane of objects, the plastic carrier bag, into something which has a value which has nothing to do with it materially. These bags were produced, there's 1,000 of each, so in a way it mimics the kind of fine art production of prints. So that the fact that there's only 1,000 gives it a kind of monetary value, and the fact that it's produced by an artist gives it a sort of cultural value. The artists involved, some of them were very well known, and some of them were unknown. We had people like Jake and Dinos Chapman and Julian Opie. On the other hand, we had people who were just about to finish at art school. So that range, again, kind of called into question the notion of value. And here they are, walking down the street, and whether someone thinks of it as something important or whether someone thinks of it as something to fill up with newspapers and put into the dustbin is, I guess, a question. So this idea of picking something up and putting it in the wrong place. This is a proposal for a pedestrian bridge which links St Paul's to the Tate Modern, and it's where they eventually built that famously wobbly Norman Foster Bridge. The title of this is the Princess Diana Memorial Bridge, and it was at the time a very ridiculous suggestion, but now there's a big campaign to build a Princess Diana Memorial Bridge, but unfortunately the campaign doesn't back us to do it. But the idea here is that it's a little slice of Althorpe Park, which, as you may know, is where Diana grew up and where she was eventually buried. But it's dug up and strung across the Thames. And it's to do with a combination of experiences, so to experience the sort of urban heart of London, but from a picturesque piece of country landscape. It's also to do with, I guess, an idea of the crossing, the journey from one side to the other being a kind of distinct experience. And it's also to do with, I guess, a connection with the hysterical culture of Diana memorials, which is forever getting larger in the UK. The nice feature on the bridge is the carving along the side of it, which is the lyrics to Elton John's rewritten Candle in the Wind. And in relation to the Norman Foster Bridge, there is a kind of question as to whether building a bridge is such an exciting or difficult thing. I mean, it's something which I think we've mastered thousands of years ago, and to keep making it more difficult by making the problem more difficult seems a fairly ridiculous way of making a bridge. And in this case, it's a bridge which has got no tricks structurally, but is just about its meaning and the experience. This is a project for an advertising agency called Kessels Kramer, which is in Amsterdam. And here there's a kind of collaging of things and a collaging of sort of events which are put together. The site for the office is the interior of an old church, which you can see bits of church in there. And the way that it's been made into an office is through these kind of either large bits of furniture or small buildings, depending on your point of view. Each of these things has got a kind of different reference. So this part here is a sort of Wild West fort. There's a lifeguard's tower, and there's a little bit of suburban shed. Here's someone who's hard at work on a picnic table, the picnic table sits on a little bit of soccer pitch. And within each of these objects, there's also transformations, so that the window's a mirror, but it's been cut off halfway through. The Wild West Fort has got oversized sort of Georgian door surrounds and fixed shutters to it. The lifeguard tower has been gold-leafed. It's very much a kind of collage, or a series of things which don't belong together, which are put together. It's very much to do with making a narrative which doesn't have a beginning and doesn't have an end, which is kind of completed by the occupation of it. So either that's through your experience of it, as through the actual addition of garden gnomes or these lifesaver things, or Lenin's head. So it's to do with something which is an architectural strategy which can then begin to kind of grow with its occupancy. So the attempt here is to make something which gets better as the longer the architect hasn't been there. In this sense, it's engaging with a kind of ad hoc DIY kind of approach, that's embracing it and saying that's welcome within the project. So within this sort of idea of collage, and also a kind of idea of engaging with popular culture, I've got two images of the Sgt. Pepper's and the White Album. This one was by Peter Blake, and this one was by Richard Hamilton. And they seem, in a way, to present the two poles of what pop might be. Either everything or nothing. And in this sense, this is perhaps connected to thinking of the Farnsworth House as a piece of pop rather than a piece of modernism. It's a piece of communication rather than a piece of spatial architecture. Another slogan, perhaps the most important one, kill the modernist within. And it's a slogan that we like to say to ourselves as a kind of mantra. And what we try to get from it is to forget shadow gaps, to welcome back history, and to essentially become less architectural than we were before. This is a project about remaking a piece of history or a historical form. This was a picture we found in a book which it was a fantastic book which had no descriptions of anything, but it had the whole history of architecture through these kind of nice etchings. And this one was something that kind of intrigued us. And it ended up through a series of transformations as this kind of object, I guess. So it's a scaled down version of the previous picture. It's been transformed a little bit so that the tower becomes a tower block, but it's also made as a sort of piece of sky as well. The whole surface is covered with these little discs which are held on pins, and they kind of move when the wind blows on them. And I think they're the kind of thing that you see in second-hand car showrooms, that kind of thing which attracts your attention. So but when they cover the whole of this object, they have this very weird effect. It looks a little bit like it's some sort of form of electronic screen or something like this. So there's a kind of conflation between a whole series of things to do with the reference of the object and its scale, to do with the status of the original object and the material that it's constructed from. And again, it's very much to do with the outside. It's what's on the outside that counts. It's that thing which you connect with. The idea of surface decoration being at least as important as the kind of spaces that you're making as an architect. So again, this idea of drawing on traditional forms, or drawing on kind of almost kind of cheesy, ridiculous historical forms. This is a project called, quite grandly, the New Civic, which was a series of temporary public art installations around an area of London called King's Cross, which is a bit of a shithole. It's it's a big sort of transport hub, and it's had planning blight for about 30 years, so they've decided whether to build the Eurostar terminal there or not. And I think they have actually eventually decided to say yes, but so that means it's had no investment for about 30 years. So it's really London's unofficial red light zone. It's where if you want to buy crack on the street, this is where you'd go. We were commissioned to celebrate the millennium, the turn of the millennium at King's Cross, and signal a whole new life for this really quite depressing area. And the way that we chose to do that was really to ask some questions about the brief, what we've been asked to do. Some of the questions were, what's the point of public art? What's it supposed to celebrate? And who's interested in it? And shouldn't they be at home watching TV? The first one is a thing called the split clock, which is a clock face that's cut into two halves and plonked on top of this canopy in front of the station. And it still works, the hands still go round, but it's a really difficult thing to try and piece it back together mentally to make it tell the time. But it's kind of obviously a take on the sort of, I guess, Victorian civic object of the station clock. And here's two of them here, and there's a whole load more because there's another big station right next to this one here. So there's no problem telling the time anyway. You've probably got it on your mobile phone. So it's to do with taking an object which once had a use, but which now no longer has its sort of direct functional use of telling the time, but it's got a sort of symbolic use. It's a piece of civic furniture. And by cutting it in half, it's turning it into a modern piece of civic furniture, because cutting it in half makes it a problem. This was another piece which was a kind of electronic fountain that faced onto a really grotty car park. So this was the kind of place that as you're measuring up you see very sort of dodgy goings-on occurring there. And it's really to do with taking something which is, I guess, an icon of sort of traditional European ideas about what civic space should be. So imagine continental Europeans debating around the civic fountain. And this is something which you can experience as you park your car to go into the station. It's also a celebration of the kind of, how can I say this? The only kind of spurting that is going to happen around this area with its levels of prostitution. It's a very different kind of urban spurt. And I guess the sort of point of this project is to ask some questions about the nature of public space, or making works for public space. And that's kind of summed up, I guess, by saying that the city isn't a classical piazza, and it's not a modernist plaza, and it's not a situationist street. It's what it is. So again, revisiting very, very old modernist rhetoric. It's one of the most important modernist icons was the ocean liner. Both in terms of how a building might be organised, but perhaps even more so about what a building might look like, which is why even to this day there's a lot of buildings which are very pleased to look like ships and have portholes in and kind of funny handrails which are ship-esque. the question now really is when ocean liners are not something which are part of any kind of experience, apart from, in this case, something that you can look at, a digitally rendered kind of ghost going across the screen. Does that give us a different outlook on modernism? Does it mean we need to reassess certain issues? And here finally is the last special guest. It's Le Corbusier himself, and he's obviously just been watching Titanic, and in a way it's a plea for very unmodernist kind of unmodernist sentiment to creep in back into architecture. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you very much. And, well, if anyone's got any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Maybe not.